I think we're seeing two things really. One is we're seeing CEOs that have personal agendas, often behaving in quite a narcissistic way, seeking attention, but also using the company's influence and wealth and position to drive their own personal agenda. And I think so. That's one aspect. The other aspect is companies that are allowing more radical elements in their workforce to organize and drive the agenda upwards, and then not stopping it in time.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working.
Hi, everybody. So today we're going to talk about what is going on at senior levels of large organisations. I want to dig into the reasons why we're seeing some spectacular fails around DEI and HR issues, ending in employment tribunals, dreadful news headlines, and significant financial and reputational damage to the organisations. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is, why is nobody senior stepping in to stop the madness? And also, what happens when it's the CEO or someone else who's very senior who's the person actually pushing the madness? Oh my God, this is making me think, how on earth did we get here? So I have to say, I've always found senior leadership to be rather a sort of closed and mysterious world. I'm kind of picturing like mahogany tables and expensive suits, I guess largely based on what I've seen in films and kind of, I don't know, the TV shows, Succession, things like that. But one reason I think for that feeling of mystery is it's actually really hard to find people who will talk honestly about how it all works. Everybody seems to be rather sort of discreet, I guess for obvious reasons. Happily, I found somebody who I'm hoping is going to be at least a little bit indiscreet, who knows about this world. So I'm hoping that he'll provide some of the answers to some really important questions which are coming up. So this is the author, Paul Sweeney, whose background in business includes many years as an independent strategic advisor to multiple FTSE firms. He was Chief Strategy Officer at the Unite Group, the student accommodation provider, from 2020 to 2023. And he's also worked for the international management consultancy, Bain. Okay, did I get that right, Paul?
You did. And I'm very happy to be here, very happy to be honest.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Now, our paths cross because you've just written a brilliant book, which is called Magnetic Nonsense, which is a blistering critique of what you think isn't working about today's corporate workplace culture. And it covers loads of the things that everybody loves to hate, from meetings culture and values statements and ESG. Could you just tell us why you wrote the book and why are you feeling so disruptive now? Like, have you just made a ton of money in the corporate world and now you just don't care anymore?
I did have a chance to take a year off last year, and that made me reflect on a few things. And, I said in the book, unlike probably some people that get to senior positions in big companies, I actually spent quite a bit of time working right at the bottom of an organization once, and not just a kind of summer job in your holiday home village on your way to Cambridge kind of thing, but, properly working as an employee at the bottom of a big airline. Then I had many middle management roles, later consulting, and later a C-suite role. And I guess I was reflecting on the fact that no matter where I went in my career, I saw the same nonsense and bullshit everywhere. And it was really spookily, eerily the same. The same language, the same mistakes, the same initiatives, the same consultants telling people to do the same things that weren't working, but bizarrely unchallenged and unquestioned. So I took a bit of time out last year to write the book because I wanted to see if I could figure out why. A bit like the kid in The Sixth Sense who sees dead people everywhere. I kept on seeing the same bullshit everywhere, and it was just, I was curious. I wanted to try to figure out why and whether we could do anything about it.
Mm. And so your book kind of covers some stuff about kind of structures and hierarchy and processes, but also culture and fads and those sorts of things. And the same ideas that you're right. We just all do it this way because everyone does it this way, and it clearly doesn't work. So I don't. I guess, the name of this podcast is turning out to be pretty universally applicable, I think. So your expertise is mainly in the corporate world. So I think probably most of the examples that we'll talk about today will come from that kind of world. And obviously we'll get some analysis from you. But I do think the the dynamics are likely to feel familiar to members of our audience who are more familiar with the public sector and the charity sector possibly as well. So I think in the UK, we are seeing problems within the NHS, for example, and various police forces, a couple of absolutely shocking employment tribunals going on at the moment. And it's not clear how much is coming from the top down, but at least it has certainly not been prevented by anyone senior. We can certainly confirm that. So I guess, we'll talk about the corporate world today, but I think it'd be interesting to hear from audience members as well what the similarities and differences are when looking at public sector. I know some charities as well. I've got some sources at some charities who say that all is not well there either. Okay, so let's come to the present day. I think you and I agree that we're seeing some pretty weird stuff going on that basically make the public think, basically, how the F does that happen? Like, how does that... These are supposed to be these huge organizations, with plenty of money, loads of people work there. We're told all these people are super clever. They're really well paid. And yet you're seeing some absolute shockers. So do you have some examples for us that have caught your eye, maybe in the last kind of year or so? And I've got a bit of a list as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting ones was at Aviva when the CEO, Amanda Blank, said that no non-diverse hire at Aviva without it being signed off by me and the chief people officer. And actually, for me, if I was working in Aviva and thinking about hiring a senior person, I would read that message as, don't dare hire a white middle-aged man. And I think that sends a very strong signal all the way down through that organization about what the CEO is aiming to achieve there. Yeah.
And it sounds like, there wasn't really any sense of whether it was from anything other than her own personal views. This feels like people turning their own personal political views into company policy. Is that what we're seeing?
I think we're seeing two things, really. One is we're seeing CEOs that have personal agendas, often behaving in quite a narcissistic way, seeking attention, but also using the company's influence and wealth and position to drive their own personal agenda. And I think so that's one aspect. The other aspect is companies that are allowing more radical elements in their workforce to organize and drive the agenda upwards. And then, as you say, not stopping it in time. So it seems to be there's a sort of top-driven piece and a bottom radical-driven piece in the mix, as far as I can tell.
That's interesting. I guess another example I would point to from the sort of top down maybe is there's a chap, I think he's still the CEO of Wickes, the UK hardware store, called Fraser Longdon, who basically quite confidently insulted his customers who didn't share his views around what he would probably call trans rights. Other people might call, I don't know, gender trans issues. There were two separate occasions. On the first occasion, he called people with gender critical views bigots. And on the second occasion, he said that people with those views were not welcome in Wickes stores. Now, that didn't land very well, for obvious reasons. But this is somebody really senior just saying that publicly. So I guess that gives us an idea of how confident these guys feel kind of talking like that. I'm not sure what his own agenda is or his own personal life, whatever. It's none of my business. But it just doesn't seem very appropriate to be saying that sort of thing. Plus, there was a huge amount of bad press that came from that. And so I'm sure there will have been certainly reputational damage from that and presumably financial.
I'm honestly surprised he still has a job, because I think that's an outrageous thing to say to your customer base, that if you don't share his views on trans issues, you're not welcome to shop in the store. I think I might understand it more if he owned the company and was prepared to take the financial hit in a company that he owned, but he's not the owner, he's just an employee. That's why I find it quite astonishing that he's still in role, really.
Yeah, so we've still got open questions about what's going on there. Maybe we can get into who you think should have stepped in that hasn't. We'll get into that later. In the UK, another good example was John Lewis. So Dame Sharon White, who I know has stepped down now from the main leadership role there. Basically, it was their LGBT kind of in-house magazine, and that had advice for parents of trans-identifying children, and it was suggesting places where they could buy binders. It was recommending mermaids, which is quite a controversial charity. As if this is all. I don't know what they thought they were doing, presenting that medical advice in a magazine to staff. So that was pretty strange in itself. That was certainly signed off by the chief marketing officer, because he told me that on LinkedIn. And then there was also an exhibition which involved some rather strange characters who work at John Lewis or Waitrose, and that kind of blew up over a weekend. And because they were identifiable, it then became actually kind of, I think there was a risk to staff at that point. You said which Waitrose store they work in or whatever.
Yeah.
This doesn't make them look great. A lot of people are concerned about these sorts of issues. So, I mean, it only takes one weirdo to turn up at their store and you've got a huge problem there.
Yeah, for me, this is an example of what I was talking about where you can allow small groups inside big organizations that are pushing a radical agenda to get way more airspace and resources than they deserve. And if you don't watch it, it can get out of control. And I think this is exactly what happened in John Lewis, where their LGBTQ plus network produced this magazine, and actually it's an example of a small radical element causing a lot of trouble in the organization. Coca Cola is similar, got in trouble when a staff member on their mandatory diversity training leaked the slides to the media. And some of the slides were telling white employees in Coca Cola to be less white by being less oppressive and less racist. Coca Cola got in a lot of trouble when people pointed out that the training material itself was racist. In fact.
Right. So, I mean, it's not really clear with Sharon White, and she has now left John Lewis. It's not really clear whether she had personal reasons for being, finding that to be a pet cause for her, or if she just didn't do anything to stop that. And then there are a couple of other examples, aren't there?
Probably the most famous one is the Budweiser one, where their VP of marketing, Elisa Hernescheid, came out and said we had this hangover. Bud Light had been kind of a brand of fratty, kind of out of touch humor, and it was really important we took another approach. And their decision on another approach was to, do an ad campaign with a trans influencer, which resulted in a 25% drop in the sales of Bud Light in the US. If you take a strong position on something, by doing that, you can alienate a lot of people, and this is exactly what happened there. But it would be interesting to figure out whether that decision got as far as the C-suite. I suspect it probably did.
And then there was Alison Rose, who is now no longer at NatWest. I think actually she's running a diversity consultancy now. Might be relevant, might not be relevant. But she was. So it's not really clear whether that was connected to the debanking scandal involving Nigel Farage, and then her handling of that. Question marks over whether her own politics were coming into that. I mean, the whole thing was a mess in the end. But then going on to run a diversity consultancy possibly tells us something about some of her motivations. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And the other thing, this kind of thing leaves you open to accusations of hypocrisy. With private banking debanking Nigel Farage, but probably providing banking services for Russian oligarchs and all kinds of dictators, so, you have to be very careful when you get into this stuff.
I mentioned in a previous episode with Steve Harrison, who's from the world of advertising. He talked about Unilever and Procter and Gamble making big statements around this stuff as well. We also talked about Jaguar, he and I, and that decision around their complete change of direction with their brand. I mean, he said from a creative perspective, he said it was too early to say whether it had been a success or not. It looked to me like, at very least, a very commercially risky decision to alienate such a large proportion of your customers and create such a lot of press around it. It may turn out to be genius, but that seems pretty high risk as well. And I think their CFO became the CEO, and I think it looks like he had quite a close relationship with the chief marketing officer as well. And it sort of looks like together they decided that was the right way to go. But do you agree that that's a high risk?
It's completely high risk. I mean, the brand has a lot of history and a lot of fans around the world. And I think what they did there is extremely risky. I mean, as you say, it's too early to tell whether it'll pay out, but it does feel like it was driven by elements of personal agenda rather than a strategic branding decision. I mean, there are other ways you could modernize that brand without doing what they did.
That's true. There's another recent one, which was Virgin Active, So the GB News presenter Michelle Dewberry went into a changing room and she said that she saw what she described as a man in there. And so she questioned the policy on that. And they came back saying, people can use whichever bathrooms changing rooms they want based on their gender or the gender identity or wherever they feel most comfortable. So that might be a slightly different issue. For me, that's about how politics have got into policy. And, but again, that feels like a hell of a policy move with massive risk to that. There's huge risk there. I mean, if anything goes wrong in one of those changing rooms.
It does make you wonder where the risk and compliance people are in these big companies. I think they've been asleep at the wheel with this stuff. They're worried about all kinds of regulatory risk, but allowing companies to produce things like zero tolerance policies, which actually are, have no basis in law, would strike me as being pretty risky. And as you say, risk assessing some of these policy decisions would be pretty sensible, I think. Although it's fine because Donald Trump has saved everyone from it now, basically because all big American companies are now starting to completely run the other way on everything from sustainability to trans rights to diversity, erasing all mentions of stuff on their website. The CEOs aren't talking about it anymore. Everything's gone quiet, quietly dismantling their DEI teams, which really just goes to you to show how authentic, some of this stuff was in the first place.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on that. When now you're seeing that all unraveling, is your kind of corporate, I mean, I don't know whether you're particularly cynical yourself, but is your kind of corporate cynicism going, yeah, they were never into it in the first place, I'm not surprised at all?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was essentially, I think, in a lot of companies, I think they felt obliged to do it more than they genuinely held it dear to their hearts as a cause, but it was expected. Pressure came. Actually, a lot of it originated in the HR departments. I know we're a bit hard on HR sometimes, but they deserve it. So a lot of the stuff came from HR. Some of it came, from board members worrying about it, their own reputations. Some of it came from the expensive PR consultancies that advise boards, who were starting to set up the whole practices based on spinning stuff for companies around this. So I think there were a number of influences at the time.
Yeah. And when we spoke before, you said that you think what we're seeing now really exposes this idea of this illusion of governance.
Yes.
That you think was never really there anyway. It's been a bit of a sham for a while that all these senior board people are actually doing anything useful, and that actually risk is really considered, and that what we're seeing now is just exposing how badly that's been working for a long time. So you weren't really surprised?
No. I mean, there's a chapter in my book about the whole illusion of corporate governance, as I've called it, because boards are largely useless. And if you look back at the sort of history of the 250 biggest companies that collapsed in the UK over the past decade, some in really bad scandals, the boards were nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. They didn't fulfill their role. They're often completely detached from what's actually going on in the organization. Many of them are portfolio non-executives who are just sitting on as many boards as they can. And their main concern is for their own reputation, squeezing the maximum amount of cash out of it and covering their arses in case the shit hits the fan. And the second line of defense is the audit, which is completely a waste of time, outrageous waste of time. In those 250 collapses, the auditors only raised a flag in 25% of the cases, despite the fact they now charge FTSE companies over £1 million a year for their audit services, and the audit partners are paid over £1 million a year on average in the Big Four. There's a think tank in Sheffield University looking at this, and their conclusion was that it's unique in being the only industry in the world where the rewards for failure and mediocrity are sky high.
Okay.
Apart from that, it's all fine.
Great. God. So can you just explain to us what are boards and how should they work?
Well, the board is supposed to be the ultimate form of governance that even the CEO has to effectively report into the board. So they are there, in theory, to provide a check and a balance and an assurance on what the company is doing. In reality, it's kind of weird because the board has a big hand in hiring the CEO and often some of the other executive team. And presumably they do that based on the fact that they think those people are of good character. But then they set in place coercive systems and that try to make sure the CEO behaves well by linking their incentives to things like employee scores or sustainability or DEI targets, which when you think about it, is a bit weird. And that just encourages people to game things. Yes, and the boards themselves, they meet once a month. They sit on some committees, but in general, I would say they don't have much idea what's really going on in the
So
company.
how many people are there on a board, and who is on that?
It sort of depends. Anywhere between 6 and 12. Typically, well, you'll have a chairman, some independent non-executive directors, and then some executive directors from the company. It's typically the CEO, the CFO, and possibly one or two others, depending on the company.
You mentioned the non-executive directors.
Yeah.
What's their story? Why are they there, and who are they?
So they are typically towards the end of their careers. They are often former senior executives or CEOs, and it's a sort of an interesting club, really. There's been a lot of efforts to try to make boards more diverse and representative, but I don't think it's worked because even though you have some headline diversity, in gender, in race, in sexuality, etc. A lot of them still have the same kind of life experience. They've gone to the good universities, they're graduates of the same business schools, they work in the same consultancies, they've been, senior executives in the same kind of companies. So they've lived their lives in that corporate cocoon of seniority. So you get very little diversity of thinking on many of these boards.
And so these non-executive directors, do they get paid to do these
Oh
these
yeah,
roles?
yeah, quite a lot. So
Like how much?
well, in FTSE 100 companies, they're earning six-figure sums for being a non-executive director, which is a couple of days work a month at best. And
Right.
there's some effort, there's some research that the higher CEO pay gets, the higher the non-executive pay gets as well, which would you know indicate to anyone looking in that there's an element of collusion on pay between those two groups actually.
Hmm. Okay. And so and are they actually responsible for anything personally if anything goes wrong?
Possibly. Yes, you can be on the hook for compliance issues, for legal issues if the company is seen to have acted, in a bad way and you knew about it. So you can be on the hook for things, and which is why there's a lot of angst in that community about making sure your butts are covered with with any with any scandals or with any issues that you might come up with.
So there can be situations where sticking your fingers in your ears is the right thing to do because that minimizes your risk.
Yeah, completely. Yeah,
Okay. So that's the main, that's called the main board, right?
that's the
That
main
kind of
board.
that's the super
Yeah,
senior level. And then there's
yeah,
something else called, which is the exec team or the exec board or the exec committee, which is
yes,
the lower. And that's the CEO, the COO, Chief Operating Officer, CFO, Chief Financial Officer, plus
yeah,
maybe the Chief People Officer, maybe Chief Marketing Officer, mainly Chief Strategy Officer, and maybe
yeah,
Chief Technology Officer. Is that
yeah.
right? Some collection of those sorts of people. And they
So,
meet. How often do they meet?
oh, it depends. In most companies, they meet weekly. But yeah, that depends. But that's the team that actually runs the company, where the board is more about overseeing the running of the company, if that makes sense. Separation there in that the board are not allowed almost to be involved in the running of the company.
Okay, I've been talking to lots of different people about how DEI came in and how that kind of took off, particularly around sort of 2020, and who was hired, and that but basically decisions were made in a rush, let's just say. So where were you working at that time, and what do you remember from that period?
So so I joined Unite full time as an employee at the end of 2020. But in the run up to that, I was acting as an advisor to five other companies as well. So I was privy to quite a lot of discussions that happened at executive offsites and executive meetings that I was attending. When I reflect on it, I think some of it goes back to COVID. because there was a bit where I think businesses actually came out of COVID better than politicians. I think there was a general sense that most businesses had responded quite well, tried to look after their employees, tried to do the right thing, whereas politicians were all over the place. So the trust in business sort of went up. And I think that might be linked to why people then looked to businesses almost to say something about some of these issues. Yeah.
Hmm.
And then we had
Okay.
the George Floyd thing, which somehow, was one of these kind of black swan type things where, in itself, it wasn't an unusual event. I mean, plenty of people have been killed in brutal fashion by racist police in the US for donkey's years. So it wasn't an isolated incident, but something about it just captured something in the global psyche at the time and just sparked this huge rush of emotion everywhere, I think. And companies suddenly felt that they had to say something about it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that was new. People hadn't felt the need to say anything about. I don't remember anybody saying anything about anything political or social like that before that. Did that feel weird at the time? Who was telling you that you needed to say something? And did it feel odd?
Yeah, it did. It felt a little odd. And I think, again, some of it was also probably linked to the rise of social media and Twitter in particular, where, you know, um, in the old days, you could kind of just sit there and say nothing, and that was a good strategy. But, there was a feeling at this time that sitting there and saying nothing would be, probably leave you open to quite a lot of social media attacks, probably, or comments about the fact that you'd said nothing. So there was almost a feeling that like we probably need to say something, but it was a little uncertain. The whole thing was a little uncertain.
So what were those conversations then? Was it
So there was
your
some, yeah,
your
th-
HR person said you should say something?
yeah, there was some pressure coming from HR because they, for some strange reason in most big companies, they give the whole topic of workplace culture to HR, which is effectively giving an imaginary concept to an inefficient, you know, group of people most of the time, which I
Oh
always think
dear.
is quite funny.
Are you offending my whole audience?
Yeah, yeah,
Great,
yeah.
brilliant.
And yeah, I will say it's a little unfair because nobody can agree on what culture even means. There's no evidence that culture affects the performance of a business in any academic studies, and there's no evidence that any efforts to change culture make any difference. So often in big companies, as part of this whole culture stuff, you have things like listening groups, and you have all kinds of membership groups like LGBTQ plus, or women of color, or everything. Well, everything except some of the ones you think you should have, like people with kids in school who are struggling to get to the office in time, for example, would be an interesting one. Um, but so there was stuff coming up from some groups, some listening groups, basically saying the company needs to say something about this. We feel strongly about this. There was some pressure coming from the board, who had been, I think, probably influenced by PR consultants or advisors. And then there was just a general sense that everyone was starting to say something, so we better say something.
So was DEI? It wasn't. So it's not like it was always considered just cosmetic or a fad. It's not. It's not quite that cynical, is it? I mean,
Yeah,
people. The people on the boards and those exec committees are not monsters. Most people have got their own kind of personal motivations and want to be good people and
yeah,
want to be ethical and that kind of stuff. So it's not like they thought it was all nonsense right from the start, right? They thought it was kind of the right thing to do, and they also, I think, there's quite a lot of people in senior roles, if they have come from a background, um, so they've got some kind of story themselves. I think there's a real sense that they want to hand down opportunity and open up access to the business world to young people from all different backgrounds. So I
yeah,
think you do see some quite senior people saying, well, actually, I came from nothing and I've done really well, and I want to make sure that other bright kids from difficult backgrounds are
yeah,
also
yeah, yeah.
able to get in. So do you think some
And
of
and
that was going on?
I do, and I would say, when I did that research into the book about nonsense at work, a lot of it starts with good intentions. It's the same with well-being, which has proved to be spectacularly useless as a set of initiatives. It starts from a good place where people go, oh, I really, I do care about people. I want them to be well. We better hire a chief well-being officer and, start doing some yoga. And and I think almost some of the DEI stuff was coming from a similar place of really good intentions, where people went, yeah, we care about equality, we care about opportunity, we should do something about that. Um, but again, like many of these things, nobody was looking at it through an evidence-based lens, and actually going. The question that people should have been asking was, okay, so we have this intention. So what's the best way to actually make a difference, rather than let's just jump on this bandwagon, start hiring DEI people. And similar to well-being, well-being experts appeared overnight. They weren't there one day, and there was millions of them the next day. And the same with diversity. One day there was nobody, and next day, like you're got 100 consultancies knocking your door saying we're the diversity expert consultancy. And I think, well, hang on,
Yeah.
you were only set up yesterday.
Yeah, there was a definite rush, wasn't there? It was kind of
Yeah,
an explosion, really. There was a rush.
yeah,
All these people suddenly appeared.
yeah,
You could say that this market opened up and people just rushed in to
yeah,
fill
yeah,
it, and quickly anybody with the sort of lived experience could kind
yeah,
of could make this work as
yeah,
make a
yeah.
living. And suddenly they were experts just by having the lived experience, and you didn't really need
Yes.
any other qualifications.
No.
There's no training really necessary for much of it. And so I think
Yeah,
as quickly as these people rushed in, it
yeah.
also became quickly embedded within organizations. So I think DEI
Mm.
targets appeared pretty quickly from memory. I was running
Yes.
Good and Fair Employers Club at the time, which is heads of early careers. I
Mm.
remember it was pretty quick that we started saying, DEI targets, put them in place, but I don't really remember. I'd need to go back, but I don't really remember a huge amount of thought going into the detail of exactly what those targets should be,
I
and
agree.
whether and how that was to be achieved, and whether there might be any unintended consequences of this stuff, whether there were
Yeah.
any other ways to achieve it other than through the first ideas that came up. It's like, oh, that sounds great, let's do that. I don't think there was really enough time taken to assess the options and the possible ways that this could go wrong.
I think you're right. And again, one thing we probably should mention is the role of management consultancies in driving some of this nonsense. McKinsey issued a so-called piece of research that suggested that, or claimed to prove that having more diverse boards and management teams led to you outperforming the market financially. So you get these, and that research was later completely debunked by another set of academics who reran that research for the Fortune 500 and found there was no correlation between diversity and any financial performance metric, be it profit, EBITDA, revenue growth, anything else. It just wasn't true. So some of the consultancies have to take the blame for the frantic activity that was happening around this as well.
And do you think that they were pushing those ideas because they could then, once they've told you this is the problem, they can also sell you the solution, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, consultancy research is not research at all. It's mainly bogus, and it's essentially marketing dressed up as something respectable. Well-being was basically invented by Deloitte, and they produced their research that showed for every pound you spent on well-being, you get £4.70 back in productivity, according to them. And that was one of the big reasons why all companies started to jump on this well-being trend and quote their research. And it got quoted a lot in the press. Oxford University's Centre for Wellbeing Research published a report in 2023 looking at the effective wellbeing interventions across 147 UK companies with 28,000 employees, and concluded that none of the interventions in those companies made any difference to anybody's well-being.
The names Deloitte and McKinsey carry an awful lot of weight,
They do.
and I
Oh,
think there are questions about whether the credibility of those brands
yeah,
was being used to drive products and services that they shouldn't have been. I think, from what I'm
yeah,
hearing,
yeah.
I interviewed Alex Edmonds about the stats behind this stuff, and I'm not a
Mm,
mathematician, but I did
yeah,
understand that cherry picking data, how you can present something to look like serious research when really it isn't at all, depending on
yeah.
which numbers you pick, what you compare with what, and how you can make it. I'm surprised because I, like many people, just thought McKinsey's really impressive, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
And I still see people talking about McKinsey, and it's a kind of way to stop the conversation. And McKinsey says that there were 4 reports, weren't there, that were all
4
pushing the
reports,
same
all
message.
saying the same thing. I can't believe how they get away with complete nonsense most of the time. Them and the other big consulting firms. And what they're very good at is, growing people in the firm and then shipping them out into industry to take senior roles. Once they're out there, that's their entry point for all their so-called research, for their business development. And often those senior executives who are ex-McKinsey will bring the firm back in time and time again, to do consulting for them.
So the ex-McKinsey employees go out, get new jobs, and then they become clients of McKinsey, right?
It's a brilliant model. And, people look at the brand and go, oh, yeah, this is amazing. But actually the whole, I covered this in the book a little bit, but the whole consulting business model is a bit of a scam. They trigger our aversion to uncertainty, which is an evolutionary hangover. They promise to sort of explain the past through a very rational lens, and then they convince us that we can control the future, which of course we can't. Daniel Kahneman, the famous economist, Nobel Prize winning economist, said that the illusion that we have understood the past, which is what consultancies give us, feeds the further illusion that we can predict and control the future, and that illusion is very comforting. So that's essentially why we buy consultants, for comfort, but we don't often look at what actually happened afterwards.
Interesting. And does anybody question any of this? Everyone just goes along with it?
Most people just go along with it. Most executives, including HR directors and CPOs, don't actually read any research. I think in the Center for Evidence-Based Management in the US, according to their survey, I think something like only 14% of senior executives said that they had ever even read any academic research or really dug into a topic like that. So all this stuff just gets pushed out there, and people accept it as a fact.
So that's why they wouldn't have scrutinized the 4 McKinsey reports.
Yeah, most people won't go to the back and read the small print and go, "Oh my God, that's so ridiculous, you lazy bastards!" And that's the whole basis of your bloody research. What a crock of shit! It's hilarious. Yeah. It's just.
That data looks very flimsy looking back, and it's quite shocking the way that those ideas took off, considering that the data was never there. So, and was there also? So we talked about the kind of the plus points of doing this, of doing DEI, and becoming more diverse. What was the fear of not doing it? Was there a fear? Because I remember at that time there was a kind of like people used to say, "Oh, pale male stale," which I now think is really offensive. I probably said it back then. I don't know. It was just like a sort of casual thing people just sort of said. It was kind of. I think we were trying to correct and we overcorrected by just being horrible to everyone. God, I've got to take some. I need to do some penance for some of this stuff. This is sort of sounding like, God, this was me in 2020. And there was a sort of. So was there a. What do you think would have happened if they hadn't done anything on DEI? Was there a fear for the reputation of the organisation? Because there was a lot of stuff about look at the board of Nike or whoever. They're all these white blokes. It did look bad. It did look bad. And then if there were problems with the products and services, they were sort of tied to the fact that they had this really undiverse, senior leadership team. Was that part of it? It was pretty embarrassing, wasn't it?
Well, that was part of it. And I think in Unite's case in particular, there was a recognition that the customer base, which was completely Gen Z, Gen Alpha, were probably students were probably the most vocal about some of this stuff. And there was a recognition that, we needed to be careful, I guess, in making sure we didn't alienate the young people that were the company's customer base.
Yeah, that makes me think of, I'm interested in how young people have somehow grabbed the wheel in so much of this stuff. Because when I was in my 20s, no one cared what I thought about anything. And I'm in my 40s and no one cares. And we all care what those people in their 20s thought. When was the moment when anyone cared what I thought? I know, I missed it.
Although what is funny is you have to kind of you have to be careful with what young people tell you as well. Because one of the things they used to tell the company all the time in all our research was that, sustainability was their number one concern. Yeah. But could you get the buggers to even recycle anything in when they lived with you? Not a hope in hell. They were so lazy that they just couldn't. They just threw everything in one bin, and so it's like a
Yeah,
great example of they don't do what they say is
yeah.
important.
I talked to Steve Harrison about some of the research from people like Edelman as
Yeah,
well about Gen Z and how
yeah,
all is not what it seems either, and actually that research is not robust either. It's the way you ask the question: do you would you boycott a company that was doing bad stuff? Most people are
yeah.
going to say yes, but if you
Of course it
actually
will.
ask them to rank what's most important when making a decision at the till about
Yeah,
which brand you're going to buy, everyone goes with the cheapest.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like,
And it's the same
so
in student accommodation, cost and
yeah,
distance to the campus. I think we just make huge mistakes in stereotyping whole generations as if they were the same. It's crazy. I know because my daughter is 17 now, and her friends are a very mixed and eclectic bunch, and there's no way you can stereotype all of them into one amorphous mass. They're individuals. They have completely
mm,
different perspectives and viewpoints. So I think
yeah.
this, it's a bit of a scam, this whole Gen Z or Gen anything stereotyping.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us, and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. Also, a message for HR professionals who are listening. If you enjoy the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to help shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you get back to the episode.
So there was kind of a mood. There was a moment when everybody kind of was suddenly doing loads of activity around this stuff. It was
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know if we lost our marbles for a bit there. So
Possibly.
so so we also we're making statements about George Floyd, even though we're in the UK and it's not
Yeah.
really anyway. And we're hiring. So we're setting all these DEI targets.
Mhm.
Did you say to me when we spoke before that it was almost immediate that you noticed that boards started hiring more diverse people into those senior roles?
Yeah, it was a very curious thing. I think it wasn't well, there were some explicit targets, but also I think it went beyond that into a positive discrimination by stealth was my view on it, because it became very clear if you talked to any headhunters or any chairs of big companies that um, they basically felt they couldn't hire any more white middle-aged men, regardless of their competence or skills. They just couldn't be seen to do it. It was too politically dangerous for them. So I think even though um, positive discrimination is illegal, I think it was very much happening in that industry at the time, the whole headhunter
Mm.
slash board recruitment space.
Yeah, we should probably explain here. I mean, it's actually quite interesting because I was looking at the early careers part, which is apprentices and graduates,
Yeah.
and they do positive action, which is legal in the UK, and that's kind of anything you might call kind of leveling the playing field up to the point of assessment and selection. So you can
Yeah.
particularly throw more money at going to campuses where there are more diverse students. You can spend less money on going to others. You can give these people extra confidence training, which you don't offer to these people. You can offer
Yeah.
insight days to people with disabilities so that they feel more confident coming to the interview. So you're giving them a lot of help, but it's not actually, you're not giving them the questions in advance. You're not,
Yes.
you're not, do you want them to, what you're trying to do is give them, is increase your pipeline so it's as diverse as possible. And also to help the people that you want more of, who you think are less likely to perform well in interviews, but are probably very bright and very capable. You want to give them as good a chance as possible of being successful
Yes,
at
indeed.
selection stage. But you
Yeah.
don't in your selection decisions, they should be based on merit. So
Yes.
that's positive action. So I feel fairly confident that with exceptions, a couple of exceptions like things like the RAF who made a mistake with their pipeline,
Yeah.
that wasn't really happening at junior level. So I was like, I don't think there is any discrimination. We are doing positive action. Some of it's a bit close to the line. Not sure about some of it, but
Yeah.
more ethically than legally, actually. But I didn't think it was happening. But now I understand that it was happening more at senior level, and senior level recruitment is much kind of more shadowy.
Oh
So
yeah,
there's more dark corners that you can hide this stuff, right? Because who's going to
it's
know?
another Ponzi scheme, actually.
So you're hiring much smaller numbers,
Hmm.
and it's all much more about connections and senior people. So you could, I mean, there are these headhunting firms. So Green Park is one, Involve is another,
Yeah.
who basically will bring you diverse candidates only, I think.
Mhm.
I mean, the idea is that they're supposed to be using them as well as going out to market and also
Yeah.
interviewing all the the middle-aged straight white guys. But who's going to know? Who's going to know that you only interviewed two middle-aged white blokes?
Yeah.
No one's going to know. Who's going to report you? Like and the guys that got discriminated against don't know about it because they never got
No.
invited to
No. So
partake in the.
the whole thing is very murky, and there's no visibility. So you're never going to know how many candidates were shortlisted, why they were, how many people were excluded for these reasons that are, bordering on illegal. You'll never know. It's a dark and murky world. It's one that I always think is really interesting because the headhunters make, huge fees on the appointments of senior people in FTSE 100 companies. But then when those people fail, 18 months to 2 years later, of which somewhere between 50 and 70% of them will, and leave the company, there's no refunds. And the same headhunter gets the assignment to find the replacement. So it's a
Mm.
really, it's always struck me as being a weird Ponzi scheme.
And it's huge. It's huge sums of money, isn't it?
Oh,
Is it
yeah.
still 30% the fee? I worked for a
Yeah.
headhunting company at the very start of my career, and it was
Yeah. Yeah.
30%. So for $100,000 job,
Yeah.
the firm that finds the successful candidate gets 30 grand.
Yeah.
So for bigger salaries, you're talking about a huge amount of money that these
Oh,
people are
yeah.
making, right?
Hundreds of thousands of pounds per candidate. I mean, some of these guys make millions.
So no wonder they're all doing so well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
So
it's there's no consequences though. It's really funny. It's like, right, here we found you this amazing candidate, and look at their track record, which is predictive of their future success, but isn't actually if you look at the data. And they sell the dream, and then when that candidate fails, there's no recourse.
So if the employers are using these sorts of headhunting companies to interview a disproportionate number of diverse people, and
Mhm.
they want the photo to look good, they want to have a woman, they want to have some people of color. Is that what is driving them to pick people that maybe aren't that brilliant or are okay or are perfectly capable, but they didn't actually thoroughly investigate the market? And is that where this awful phrase DEI hire is coming in? Because people do start to suspect that if somebody isn't as brilliant as you might expect, and they happen to be a woman or they happen to be black, that we're getting this feeling that how thorough was the search for this successful candidate? Is that what this is coming from?
So I think there's two sides to this. I think one might be, and I don't have any evidence to show this because it would be hard to assess, but one might be that candidates are getting some jobs that may not have been the best qualified, on merit. But that is something that's, it's difficult to prove. But I think a bigger problem is that for diverse candidates who have been selected because they have high merit and high capability, they now have to live with a cloud of suspicion because of the whole DEI debacle, which
Yeah.
is a side effect which really is unfortunate and actually makes the case for diversity harder in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And
yeah.
there's some good evidence that things like mandatory unconscious bias training, for example, can activate bias and make people resentful of diverse candidates getting senior roles. So comes back to this evidence-based piece where people started running off doing all kinds of things and training, spending all kinds of money, but without any evidence to show either that it made things better or that in fact it was risky.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. And we we should say also there are plenty of middle-aged white blokes who also are pretty mediocre who
I was going to say
who people don't know.
this is not a diversity issue. The executive teams of most big companies are at least 50% Muppets, as far as I can tell.
50% Muppets.
Yeah,
That's the title of your next book. Well,
probably.
okay. So one of the questions I've been asking is, I understand that there is something in most big organizations called a risk team. And I see risk everywhere around all this DEI stuff. And yet I don't see the risk team ever piping up to say, oh, some of this stuff's a bit iffy. You might want to be careful around this stuff. But I think you're saying that the risk teams focus more on sort of the nitty-gritty of kind of compliance, regulatory risk. And so they're not thinking about the risk of, say, for example, you've got a CEO who is very, political or has got personal kind of skin in the game, and is driving this organization in a direction which has, I think, really big, potential financial, reputational, legal risk. For everybody involved, for all the employees, if this whole organization tanks, a lot of people are out of business, the suppliers will lose money. When these things go wrong, they go really wrong. And I don't understand why having an out of control chief exec is not, or anybody senior is not considered a bigger risk that should be taken really, really seriously.
I think you're right. And risk teams in big companies, and they're biggest in things like banks and insurance companies. And the only reason they exist is because those companies can't help incentivizing staff to sell things to customers they don't need. And because that's the way to get pay and success. So risk teams focus on regulatory risk, the things they get in trouble for, i.e. screwing over customers, more than anything else. So Lloyds Bank, for example, PPI scandal, I think cost Lloyds Bank over £30 billion in compensation. And that's left a very big mark on the bank. And so therefore their risk and compliance people are all over the bloody place, like ants, trying to make sure that, despite the fact they still incentivize people badly, trying to make sure that people don't behave badly. Now, those people are, very focused on that. I doubt if they would have the courage to go and tell the CEO that they were the biggest risk in the bank, not the behavior of their employees. But you would think that really should be the chairman's job. The CEO effectively reports to the chair, and the chair and the board should be the ones going, okay, great that you feel strongly about this stuff, but actually, where's the line here? And where's the risk here? And should you be using this as a platform for your own views? I think those conversations seem to be missing in all of this.
Mm-hmm. But still, it just comes down to one person. The chair is the only person that can rein things in if a company is going crazy.
No, the chair has some influence, but in listed companies, the shareholders will have more influence probably. So if the CEO starts to do something and the share price starts to tank, then people sit up and pay attention because the investors will go, hang on a second. We didn't invest in this company so you could try and solve racism. We invested in this company to make some money. And you've alienated, a whole bunch of our customers here. What the hell are you doing? So I think that's the pressure ultimately that would lead to a change of CEO, faster in some ways.
So the whole thing, there needs to be financial. So there needs to be a financial impact before it sort of circumvents this kind of senior level decision makers, correct? So probably,
so.
although Bud Light's an American company, so I'm less familiar with that. Presumably, when their share price began to drop, that's when you start to see people going, "Oh God, we need to do something here." But until it's like the risk of that happening, it hasn't happened yet. So you're still on the kind of the track that you describe, and it's not until something actually goes wrong that you then go into a whole different system which has different checks and balances around it, which involves the shareholders.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like that. I think it might have been a Hemingway quote, which was, when you go bankrupt, it goes very, very slowly and then really quickly. And so it's kind of that with risk as well, right? So it's building up very slowly, and then all of a sudden it blows up.
Yeah. Well, a good example was this Virgin Active gym saying that anybody can use any changing rooms. And you think, well, there's got to be risk involved there. But presumably people are only going to notice, I guess, either when people stop saying, I don't love that policy, I don't think it's right, I'm not going to go to that gym anymore. So when gym memberships drop, if there's a big kind of press thing around that, particularly if women are saying, I don't want to work out in that gym anymore, or if something, God forbid, something nasty happens in a changing room, And then if it gets to that point, then you've got a whole different system comes into play, I assume.
Yeah, I think that's right. And but I do think more risk, people need to pay attention to these risks more, definitely
Mm.
indeed, because they can be quite significant.
Yeah. I've heard rumors that there are some people in really senior roles who have children who are trans identified.
Mm.
And I think that sometimes it looks like they are so close to that issue and they are so invested in creating a world for their child that as they want it to be and as they have promised their child will be. And now that it's becoming clear that there are complications with this, and actually there are clashes of rights, all over the place, and not everybody's agreed on this, and they're not going to agree on this. And it's not like
Yeah,
gay rights. This is something different. This is not quite a civil rights movement. This is
no,
actually something much more complicated. And I think at that point, I don't know what you do if you've got, say, somebody senior who really wants to go really big on Pride, for example, this year,
yeah,
which is now very, very big on all the trans messaging. If you've got somebody in a really senior role who's invested in a personal capacity like that and wants to go really big on it this year because, the trans community, they would say, is under attack, and, everything happening in America, I guess, what's that conversation, and
yeah.
who's going to stop that from happening if they want to go in that direction?
I think that's a good question, and I think from a kind of governance point of view, I think you should treat it like any other conflict of interest. So if, for example, somebody senior in the business was involved in making a decision that, you know, gave the company's money to, or gave the company's business to a friend of theirs or a relative, for example, they would have to excuse themselves from that decision-making process because of conflict of interest. And I think companies need to have some kind of policy that does the same for these issues. If you are heavily emotionally invested in something and have a hugely strong opinion, um, you know, um, perhaps that bias, you should recognize that and step to the side when those issues are being discussed, because otherwise I can't see a way to manage it, particularly if it's the CEO, because
Mm.
the loudest voice will win there. So I think companies need to pay attention to this and go, right, if this is a conflict of ideology or a conflict of interest here somehow, you know, that you should excuse yourself from the conversation.
Mm. And could be any kind of religious belief, or any
Hmm.
kind of personal political views, or
Yeah,
anything on Gaza and Israel, or anything like that. But
yeah.
I think there doesn't seem to be, from what you're saying, doesn't seem to be any way for those people to be identified and to either ideally remove themselves, and if they don't remove themselves, for them to be removed from conversations around kind of strategy and decision making.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I guess, going back to your point about risk, and I think you did mention it with the John Lewis thing, but some of these decisions can cause quite a lot of risk to creep into the employees. So, for example, Starbucks, when Howard Schultz decided to have this Race Together campaign, he instructed all the employees of Starbucks to write "Race Together" on every customer's cup of coffee. And that caused, quite a lot of arguments. It caused a lot of risk to employees in coffee shops because some customers felt that they shouldn't be pushing that ideology towards them. The Telegraph had a really good piece on the whole John Lewis scandal. I forget the name of the lady who wrote it, but the headline was, John Lewis, I don't want to know about your staff's identity choices. I just want a toaster. I
I
thought,
think that was Suzanne Moore.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah,
I thought,
yeah.
she's nailed it there. It's like people have lost the plot. Yeah,
Yeah, and it does mean the frontline employees, particularly in retail, as you say,
yeah,
and hospitality.
yeah.
You've got to think about those people, because if there is a backlash against this stuff, some people are not nice, not going to be
No,
nice
no,
about expressing their views that they don't love
no.
this stuff.
And you also have to think about, what are you hoping to achieve? And is there any evidence that what you're doing makes a difference? So I wonder how many really racist people went into Starbucks and came out completely transformed by the fact that someone wrote "Race Together" on their cup. It's really, or
Oh
you
my
could
God.
see the Israelis cancelling the Gaza invasion because Ben and Jerry's had stopped supplying them with ice cream. It's kind of, there's a bit of this that goes, right. Actually, what do you actually think you will achieve with some of this, other than signaling?
Yeah. Okay, so looking at solutions to wrap up, I guess, I mean, if we're saying that we should probably be looking at encouraging people who've got, personal kind of skin in the game to remove themselves from decision-making moments, and if they don't, there should be a way that the rest of the people involved can remove them. I guess that's probably one solution. What other solutions have you got, or do you think the whole board thing is totally broken and needs to be rethought? If we're not going to scrap it, how can we improve it?
Yeah, we won't be able to scrap it anytime soon. But I do think we need to think about ways of improving it. There's a Financial Reporting Council has a governance code, and it's completely hopeless. It basically has meant that every single organization does exactly the same thing, even though it's proven not to work in every case where organizations have gone wrong. And it talks about things like culture and values, even though, you know, the research that I've done for the book shows that those are at best abstract and possibly even imaginary. So that doesn't help. But I think finding ways to get better quality information to boards and having better representation of actual workers on the board committees, I think would be better. So there are good technologies now that can give you real time sort of feelings and emotions from the organization that bubble up. Boards could see those and they could measure the impact of some of the decisions that they take. I've been exploring some alternatives. I mean, in Germany, for example, a company of over 2,000 employees has to reserve 50% of the board seats for the employees. And I think this drives a really interesting possibility into this mix of governance, because those are the people who know what's actually going on in the company, and they can tell the other board members, they can give them a lot of insight. And I suspect that also, a CEO coming to that board with a restructuring plan will get a lot more questions and a lot more honest feedback, and probably wouldn't propose some of the dumb things that I've seen happen in big companies that I've been a consultant for. So that's one way of doing it. I've seen companies in Switzerland where this is more to do with the executive team now, where the executive team has to stand for election every year, and any member of staff can also stand. And it's really interesting as a dynamic, I think, that they do that. It's weird that we live in a democracy, but 90% of us work in organizations all day where we have no say in how they're run. It's when you think about that, it doesn't make sense. I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but I think the whole inclusion debate is completely missed the big picture. What we focused on is making sure that we're trying to increase the diversity of the 1% of people who have all the power in organizations and make them more representative. But we've completely ignored the fact that 99% of people who are by their nature diverse anyway have no say in how organizations are run and no power. And for me, that's a much bigger topic for inclusion. It should be than trying to change the mix of the 1%. And again, I think this, if you look at the age profile and backgrounds of a lot of boards, even though we've ticked some of the headline diversity things on, race, gender, sexuality, we haven't really ticked the diversity of thought box very well. A lot of them have very similar backgrounds, and I don't think that's helping. So I would advocate for far fewer financially orientated people on boards. That's again a faction that's taken over and looks at the world through kind of a spreadsheet lens of numbers, where humans don't behave that way. So I think we should have more creative people on boards. I think we should have more people from very diverse backgrounds, not the tick box diversity. And I think that would make a real difference. And faster rotation of board members. So it's probably every 7 years or so now that a board seat changes. It's too long.
And if these changes don't happen, what are your predictions? With regards to the kind of unfolding problems with DEI and kind of policies relating to kind of DEI issues, the sorts of risks we've talked about today. Are we going to keep seeing more and more of these big companies making these huge mistakes?
Even though I don't agree with Donald Trump's views on many things, I think what he has done is kind of shifted the dynamic to where it's okay to challenge some of these things, which up until now felt like it was quite risky. So I think because of that, I think there will be more challenge. I think some of the stuff where there's no evidence behind it will be challenged, and I think that will be helpful. And I think I'm hoping the companies will be more on top of not letting small radical factions, get outsized influence, as I think we saw in John Lewis. So I think there are lessons there, and I think, but now that the almost the social pressure is off the kind of DEI agenda to the in some ways because of Donald Trump and his merry buddies in the US, that will filter through to here.
And do you think that that will be the make or break factor in which big organizations kind of survive and thrive and which end up dying?
No, I don't think it's that. Yeah, it's not that existential. I think, but you will see, and you're already starting to see companies dialing back a lot on diversity and on sustainability. You had pressure from investors and big institutional funds, but they're also now starting to lose money when they take these stances, so they're dialing it all back too. So it's all sort of slowly going away, and I think some of that's good, some of that's bad. But it certainly will help, I think, with the more extreme side of some of the things we saw. They're less likely to happen in the future, is my take.
And do you think it's like the ones who are still making these mistakes, if they're still making these mistakes in 6 months to a year, is it a sign that something's really rotten at the top?
Yes, I think it is. And I think that there will be increasing pressure from shareholders, from investors, from board members, to make sure this stuff doesn't happen.
Okay, well, I guess let's just sort of see how it pans out. It's going to be really interesting to see who's paying attention, who's not, who's got control, and who hasn't got control. I'm looking forward to seeing how it pans out. Was there anything else you wanted to add that I didn't cover, or any other final parting thoughts?
No, I just think that this is just one of many areas of nonsense in organizations. I think it's quite amusing to watch some of it unfold. But it's been a fun conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate the conversation.